Ransom Eli Olds formed the Olds Motor Vehicle Company in 1897 after spending years in the family business of repairing steam engines. But the Olds Motor Company would be bought out in 1899 to become Olds Motor Works, and Ransom stepped down to the role of vice president, designing and building multiple gas, electric, and steam prototypes. But the factory burned down in 1901, and with the reconstruction, the focus would be on the Model R curved dash runabout, with an extensive marketing campaign that included two cars dubbed Old Scout and Old Steady that performed a number of public feats, including winning the first transcontinental race in 1902. Prices were around $650, and it was powered by a 5-horsepower water-cooled single for speeds up to 20 miles an hour. Using the first automotive assembly line, Olds was the first mass-produced vehicle, not only making it the best-selling brand from 1903 to 1905, but setting a new automotive sales record each year, in part by using components contracted out to other manufacturers, such as transmissions built by Dodge Brothers. Officially referred to as the Olds Automobile, the car was popularly referred to as Oldsmobile, even in a hit song of the period, My Merry Oldsmobile.
Come away with me, Lucille, in my merry Oldsmobile.
And soon the company would start using it as well. But Ransom would leave the company in 1904 to form Rio, another successful car and truck company, named for his initials, that would eventually be absorbed into the White Truck Company. And by 1908, Oldsmobile would be taken over by the newly formed General Motors. Shortly thereafter, Olds would begin sharing platforms with Buick and would quickly move up market. And of course, bodywork was done by Fisher. The Top Line Limited of 1910 used a 60-horsepower straight-six, 42-inch wheels, and had a $4,600 starting price. Soon, Olds would start sourcing components from Cadillac, such as electric starter and a V8 engine, but would then move into the mid-priced field to once again become a top 10 seller by 1921. To work around Alfred Sloan's planned obsolescence that had models being renamed every year, they simply incorporated the year into the model name, with the 1928 model F28 being replaced by the F29, and so on. And they would make an attempt to move back up market in 1929 with the spin-off Viking division. But being just before the Great Depression, it didn't last 3 years. In 1932, the 6-cylinder F-Series was joined by the 8-cylinder L-Series, raising horsepower to 87. And although prices started under $900, sales plummeted to under $20,000 for the year. But they would quickly recover to over $190,000 by 1936, putting Oldsmobile back in 5th in overall sales. In 1937, they were offering an early 4-speed semi-automatic transmission called the automatic safety transmission. And 1939 would see the naming structure start to transition from letters to numbers, with the F, G, and L series becoming the 60, 70, and 90 series, with both designations being used until after the war. For 1940, Oldsmobile would become the first manufacturer to offer a fully automatic transmission, the Hydromatic, and starting in 1942, the number of cylinders would be represented in the model name, such as the 6-cylinder 60 series Model 66 or 8-cylinder 90 series Model 98, the same time that Olds Motor Works officially became Oldsmobile. But for the war, production would move to guns and ammunition, moving back to cars at the end of 1945. The big news for the post-war era was the new Model 88 for 1949. Not only were Oldsmobiles freshly restyled for the year, but the Model 88 combined the smaller body of the Model 76 with the new 135 horsepower overhead valve 304 rocket V8 of the big Model 98 to create what many saw as a factory hot rod, effectively kicking off the horsepower wars of the early 1950s, with Oldsmobile being the brand to beat. For 1950, Olds would lead GM into the popular hardtop market with the Holiday Coupes, but the 76 was dropped for 1951, making the $2,100 88 the base model. The cars would get fully integrated fenders for 1954, by which point horsepower was up to 185 from 324 cubic inches. and they would soon be the first to offer a hardtop sedan. To celebrate GM's 50th anniversary and Oldsmobile's 60th, 88s were dubbed Golden Rockets for 1957, starting at $2,300, and the 371 V8 was available with up to 300 horsepower. In spite of a recession and criticism of GM's new styling, Oldsmobile moved up to fourth in sales for 1958, even though their total was down 70,000 to 315,000 for the year. Restyled models for 1959 would introduce a pinched grille and separated headlights that would return to Oldsmobile models repeatedly. A bigger 394 V8 was offered with 315 horsepower, and prices were starting near $2,900. Changes for 1961 included a perimeter frame and coil spring suspension, and in an attempt to enter the personal coupe market, the Starfire was introduced as a specially trimmed version of the 88, initially just as a convertible and later as a coupe with 330 horsepower. Oldsmobile entered the senior compact market the same year with the F85 and Cutlass. They were 188 to 192 inches long on a 112-inch wheelbase and 2,800 to 2,900 pounds, starting under $2,400, making it 2 feet shorter and $450 cheaper than the base Dynamic 88. Powered by a 3.5-liter 215 cubic inch V8 that would later be used by British Leyland as the Rover V8. And in 1962, a version called the Jetfire would become the first production turbocharged car, rated at 215 horsepower, or 60 more than the base version and 30 more than the Power Pack version. By 1964, the F85 and Cutlass would evolve into mid-sized offerings, and the turbo would be gone. But it would get a muscle car version as the 442, or 4-speed 4-barrel dual exhaust. Following a different philosophy than other early GM muscle cars, it was essentially just a manual transmission police package. Length had increased to 203 to 204 inches long on a 115-inch wheelbase, and weight to 3,100 to 3,500 pounds, with a base Buick 3.7-liter V6 with 155 horsepower, or a 5.4-liter 330 V8 with 260 to 290 horsepower, or 310 in the 442. Making that a 15-second car with a top speed of 130. A bigger 6.6-liter 400 version would soon be available, with up to 345 horsepower. The Cutlass would also get a new special long wheelbase wagon with a raised top and wraparound sunroof as the Vista Cruiser. And the short-lived Jetstar 1 was also introduced as a less luxurious version of the Starfire. The big cars were restyled for 1965, getting a bigger 7-liter 425 V8 with 310 to 370 gross horsepower, and seeing the introduction of the better-equipped Dynamic 88 Delta, simply referred to as the Delta 88. And proving itself once again as GM's experimental division, Olds fully entered the personal luxury coupe market in 1966 with the front-wheel drive Toronado, 211 inches long on a 119-inch wheelbase, and powered by a 385 horsepower version of the 7-liter V8. It was unlike any other front-wheel drive car at the time. With futuristic styling and a luxurious interior, it could do a mid-15-second quarter mile and nearly 140 miles an hour. The big cars would introduce the split grille in 1968 that would become Oldsmobile's trademark look for more than 35 years. The top engine would increase in size again to a 7.5-liter 455, with up to 390 horsepower in the big cars and 400 in the Toronado, allowing the division to take the GM muscle car to new levels with the new Hurst Olds. It was essentially just a special edition Cutlass that bypassed GM's 400 cubic inch cap on mid-sized cars by claiming to be a Hurst product. It used the 390 horsepower version of the 455, backed by a turbo hydromatic 400, using a Hurst dual-gate shifter. Yet Oldsmobile's demographic was getting noticeably older, prompting the Oldsmobile is now Youngmobile marketing campaign. The wheelbases of the full-size 88 and 98 reached their biggest in 1969, up to 124 and 127, and all 88s became Delta 88s. The overall length would get even longer with the restyle of 1971, and the wagon became the custom cruiser. At this point, prices started at $4,000 for a dynamic 88 and $4,800 for a 98. And yet Oldsmobile was back in third in overall sales for 1972, where they would remain for most of the next decade. They would re-enter the compact market with the Omega in 1973, essentially just an Olds version of the Chevy Nova. Starting at just over $2,600, first-year sales were $60,000. The mid-sized models were also restyled, using GM's new Colonnade design language, and the Vista Cruiser became a regular wagon with a regular sunroof. Bumper regulations would make the 98 the biggest Oldsmobile ever in 1974 at 232 inches long, and the Omega Compact would actually get bigger with the redesign the next year. But Olds entered the subcompact market, reviving the Starfire name on what was essentially a Chevy Monza. And by combining all their mid-sized models under the Cutlass banner, Oldsmobile was able to claim bestseller for 1976, although their Chevy counterparts actually accounted for more sales. But the overall sales would continue to climb, exceeding 1.1 million for 1977 when their big cars were downsized, which created a problem with the popular Rocket 350 V8 as production was not able to keep up with demand, an issue resolved by using Chevrolet's 350s in some cars, without customer knowledge. The ensuing public relations fiasco led to the creation of the GM Powertrain division, and even greater sharing among GM divisions, seen as early as the new downsized mid-size cars for 1978, that included a fastback Cutlass Salon in 2- and 4-door versions, which was offered with a Buick 231 V6, Oldsmobile 260, Pontiac 301, and Chevrolet 305 V8. 1979 saw a downsized Toronado and the introduction of the Oldsmobile Diesel, based on the Rocket V8, and it was initially very successful, spread across multiple divisions. But it was rushed to market, and it would experience head bolt failure, turning a generation of Americans off the diesel engine. 79 would also put an end to the Hurst Olds, and 80 would be the last year of the 442, making it the longest running of the original muscle car designations. The same year, the compact Omega was downsized to the infamous front-wheel drive X-Body, a platform that would be adapted and spread across other segments, starting with the subcompact Forenza and mid-sized Cutlass Sierra for 1982. But the Cutlass Supreme would remain on the rear-wheel drive platform, and revive the Hurst Olds for 1983, which would become the 442 for 1985 only, when the Omega was replaced by the Calais, later to become the Cutlass Calais, and the 98 was downsized again, this time to a front-wheel drive platform, with the 88 following the next year, while the custom cruiser continued on unchanged. All combined, making 1985 another record year for Oldsmobile, selling 30,000 more than they did in 1977, setting a new sales record and climbing into second overall for the year. But in spite of high sales volumes, a generation later there were still concerns about the increasing age of buyers, prompting another youth-focused marketing campaign with Not Your Father's Oldsmobile. For 1988, there would be a new front-wheel drive Cutlass Supreme, becoming the first car with heads-up display, and soon a 4-door version would be added to the line. Oldsmobile entered the minivan market in 1990 with the Silhouette, and a year later the SUV market with the Bravada, although both proved to be disappointing, as Oldsmobile sales began to decline. And market research suggested part of the issue was confusion over all the different Cutlass models. So in 1992, the restyled Cutlass Calais was renamed Achieva, but it didn't seem to help, and the struggling Toronado was killed off the same year. But there was a restyled custom cruiser. Clearly, Oldsmobile was due for a makeover, which started with the Aurora in 1995. Called the spiritual successor to the Toronado, it was a full-size sedan, and sold alongside the unrelated 88 and 98. With no traditional styling cues, and a 4-liter V8 based on the Cadillac Northstar. But first-year sales were under 50,000 and declined rapidly. Clinging a bit to old-school philosophy was the last new Cutlass of 1997, while Oldsmobile celebrated their 100th anniversary. This Cutlass was essentially a Chevy Malibu with a traditional Oldsmobile grille, and it barely lasted 3 years. While the new design language would carry on, with the Intrigue replacing the Cutlass Supreme, and the Alero replacing the Achieva, while the traditional 88 and 98, renamed Regency in its last few years, were killed off. By this point, Oldsmobile had fallen off the top 10, and there was talk of merging the brand with Saturn. But GM announced they would be killing off the brand, believing buyers would shift to the nearly identical Buicks. And in spite of references such as Oldsmobile Buick suggesting there was no difference between the two, many disappointed fans simply went elsewhere. There would be a new Aurora for 2001 and a new Bravada for 2002, but models were starting to be discontinued, and the brand was officially dissolved in 2004. Although sales would continue through 2005. After more than a century and more than 35 million cars, one of America's most successful and longest-running brands simply went away. And as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.